Stop scrolling for a moment, because what you're about to hear is something most people never think about until it's already too late. Over the last 30 years, 3 different countries experienced something that sounds almost impossible in the modern world. Their food systems collapsed. Not because of massive wars. Not because natural disasters destroyed farmland. But because of a slow pattern of decisions that gradually weakened their ability to feed their own people. And now in 2025, some analysts are beginning to notice something uncomfortable. The United Kingdom may be starting to show early signs of moving along that same path. Not identical and not guaranteed to end the same way, but the pattern looks familiar. Step by step. Policy by policy. Before we go deeper into this story, make sure you subscribe to the channel. If you enjoy deep investigations that explain the real stories behind global headlines, subscribing helps this channel grow and allows us to keep bringing you these breakdowns. To understand this issue, we first need to talk about something most people rarely think about: the food system. For the average person, food just appears in supermarkets. You walk into a store and see shelves full of fruit, vegetables, meat, bread, and packaged products. Everything looks stable and permanent. But behind those shelves is one of the most complicated systems on Earth. Farmers grow crops and raise livestock. Workers harvest and process the food. Trucks transport it to warehouses. Ships carry it across oceans. Packaging facilities prepare it for sale. Logistics companies coordinate deliveries. Supermarkets restock shelves daily. If several links in that chain break at the same time, the entire system can begin to fail. And here's something important most people don't realize. Food system collapse rarely starts with empty shelves. It starts with dependency. It begins when a country slowly loses the ability to feed itself and starts relying more and more on food imports from other nations. At first, this doesn't seem dangerous. Imports often appear cheaper. Global trade allows supermarkets to offer more variety. Consumers enjoy foods that aren't grown locally. Everything feels efficient and modern. But once a country becomes heavily dependent on imports, its food security no longer depends on its own farmers. It depends on whether other countries are willing and able to sell food to it. History shows just how fragile that situation can be. In 1991, Cuba experienced one of the most dramatic food crises in modern history. For decades, Cuba relied heavily on trade with the Soviet Union. The arrangement seemed stable. Cuba exported sugar, and in return it imported wheat, fuel, fertilizers, and many other essential supplies. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. Almost overnight, Cuba lost around 80% of its imports. Ships that once arrived regularly simply stopped coming. Food supply shrank quickly. The government introduced rationing. Average calorie intake dropped across the country. Within a year, the average Cuban citizen lost around 20 pounds, not from dieting but from hunger. The problem wasn't just the loss of imports. Over the years, Cuba had become dependent on imported fertilizers, machinery, and fuel. Domestic farming systems had weakened. Young workers had left agriculture. When the crisis began, rebuilding food production took years. Another example appeared in Venezuela. In the early 2000s, Venezuela had the largest oil reserves in the world. Oil exports generated huge amounts of money. With that income, the country imported massive quantities of food and consumer goods. At first, everything seemed fine. Food was widely available, and government programs made it affordable. But over time, domestic agriculture declined. Farmers struggled to compete with cheap imports. More land stopped producing food. Then in 2014, global oil prices collapsed. The revenue that paid for food imports suddenly disappeared. Venezuela's economy spiraled into crisis. The national currency collapsed. Hyperinflation exploded. Soon supermarket shelves began to empty. Long lines formed outside grocery stores. Many people simply could not find enough food. By 2017, studies showed that average body weight across the population had dropped significantly due to food shortages. Then came Sri Lanka's crisis in 2022. Unlike the previous examples, this one happened extremely quickly. Sri Lanka had a functioning agricultural system. Farmers produced rice, vegetables, and tea exports. But in 2021, the government suddenly banned chemical fertilizers and pesticides in an attempt to rapidly transition to organic farming. The policy was introduced almost overnight. Farmers did not have enough organic fertilizer to replace chemical inputs. They lacked training in new farming methods. Crop yields fell dramatically in a single growing season. Rice production dropped so sharply that Sri Lanka had to import food it previously produced itself. At the same time, the country was already facing economic pressure from debt and declining tourism. As food imports increased, the government struggled to pay for them. Fuel shortages began. Transportation slowed. Power outages disrupted food storage. Within months, public anger exploded into nationwide protests. Demonstrators stormed government buildings, and the president eventually fled the country. When researchers study these three crises, something remarkable appears. Despite huge differences in geography and politics, each country followed a similar pattern. First, domestic agriculture weakened. Then reliance on imports increased. After that, an external shock disrupted the system. Finally, domestic production could not recover fast enough, leading to shortages and instability. That pattern raises an important question. Could developed countries ever face similar vulnerabilities? At first glance, it seems unlikely. Wealthy countries have advanced economies, strong infrastructure, and global trade networks. But when analysts examine the structure of modern food systems, they notice trends that deserve attention. In the United Kingdom, roughly 60% of the country's food is produced domestically. The remaining 40% is imported. For some products, the dependence is much higher. A large portion of fruit and vegetables in British supermarkets comes from other countries, especially regions with warmer climates. Over the decades, imported food often became cheaper than locally grown products. Supermarkets focused on price competition and year-round availability. As a result, some domestic farms struggled to remain profitable. At the same time, farmland has gradually decreased as cities expanded. Agricultural land has been converted into housing developments, roads, and commercial areas. Once farmland is built over, it rarely returns to food production. Another challenge is the aging farming workforce. Many farmers are approaching retirement age, and fewer young people are entering the industry due to financial risks and demanding working conditions. Supply chains themselves have also become extremely efficient, but also fragile. Modern supermarkets operate using tightly optimized logistics systems. Instead of storing large reserves of food, stores rely on constant deliveries from centralized warehouses. Those warehouses depend on continuous shipments from domestic producers and international suppliers. This system reduces costs, but it also means there is very little buffer if something disrupts transportation or imports. The COVID pandemic gave the world a small glimpse of how quickly the system can be stressed. When people began panic buying groceries, supermarket shelves emptied within days, even though overall food production had not changed. It showed how sensitive the system can be to sudden shifts in demand. Climate change is also becoming an important factor in global food security. Droughts, floods, and extreme heat can damage crops in different parts of the world. When harvests decline in multiple regions, global food prices can rise rapidly. Countries that rely heavily on imports may find themselves competing with others for limited supplies. However, it's important to understand that none of this means a collapse is inevitable. Wealthy nations have resources, technology, and policies that can strengthen their food systems. Governments can support farmers, invest in agricultural innovation, and encourage younger generations to enter farming. New technologies such as vertical farming, hydroponics, and controlled environment agriculture are also creating new possibilities for producing food closer to cities. The key lesson from history is simple. Food systems look stable until they aren't. The crises in Cuba, Venezuela, and Sri Lanka didn't appear overnight. Each developed slowly over many years before the final shock revealed how vulnerable the system had become. That's why experts focus on prevention rather than reaction. Maintaining a balance between global trade and domestic food production is one of the most important strategies for long-term food security. So the next time you walk into a supermarket and see rows of perfectly stocked shelves, remember that those shelves represent one of the most complex systems humans have ever built. Farmers, truck drivers, shipping companies, warehouse workers, and retailers are all part of a massive network working every day to keep food moving. And like any complex system, it requires constant attention to stay stable. If you found this breakdown interesting, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next investigation. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which part of this story surprised you the most? The speed at which food systems can collapse, or the fact that very different countries followed the same pattern? Let me know in the comments, because conversations like this are becoming more important every year.